morning, friends, and welcome to worship at St. Andrew. I'm Justin Bullis, the Director of Production and the Online Worship Experience, and it is my privilege to welcome you, as always. I am grateful to share this sacred online space with you, where we are all invited, included, and valued as vital and beloved members of our broader worshiping community. Please take a moment to visit gostandrew.com/sign-in to let us know that you're here and share some information about yourself. We'd love to know from where or from when you're joining us, or if you have any prayer requests or questions about our church. If you would like to explore deeper engagement with the work God is doing in and through the St. Andrew community, you can email us directly at connect@gostandrew.com. We'd love to hear from you. Lastly, if you would like to contribute a financial gift to the work and ministry of St. Andrew, you can visit gostandrew.com/give or text St. Andrew to 28950. As Reverend Mark reminds us every week, St. Andrew is an open, affirming, inclusive congregation that welcomes all people into the full life and communion of our church. This includes saints and sinners, believers and skeptics, the lost and the found, the wanderers and the wanderers, families of all shapes and sizes, and people from every point along life's journey. No matter who you are or where you've been, no matter what you believe or even if you believe anything at all, you are welcome here and you belong here.
A legal expert stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to gain eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What is written in the law? How do you interpret it?" He responded, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But the legal expert wanted to prove that he was right, so he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He encountered thieves who stripped him naked, beat him up, and left him near death. Now it just so happened that a priest was also going down the same road. When he saw the injured man, he crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way. Likewise, a Levite came by that spot, saw the injured man, and crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way. A Samaritan, who was on a journey, came to where the man was. But when he saw him, he was moved with compassion. The Samaritan went to him and bandaged his wounds, tending them with oil and wine. Then he placed the wounded man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took 2 full days' worth of wages and gave them to the innkeeper. He said, 'Take care of him, and when I return, I will pay you back for any additional costs.' What do you think? Which of these 3 was a neighbor to the man who encountered thieves?" Then the legal expert said, "The one who demonstrated mercy toward him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise."
About 2 months ago, the New York Times carried the obituary of a Jewish woman who died at the age of 107 in a town near Tel Aviv. Her name was Mimi Reinhardt. She's one of the world heroes in the last 100 years in the world. Ms. Reinhardt was a 2-fingered typist in Poland during World War II for a Nazi SS officer who also ran a factory for the Nazi government. His factory employed hundreds of people making munitions for Hitler's soldiers. The factory owner was high up in the SS ranks. He was a womanizer, a heavy drinker, a war profiteer, but with all of his shortcomings, he somehow had developed an inner ethical core. As he saw Hitler's horrendous extermination of Jews, the handicapped, the gypsies, he decided he should and could do something. He had to do something, he felt. He developed a list of about 100 names. He gave that list to the higher officials, telling them that these employees were his essential factory workers and that they were critical to the Nazi war effort, so they needed to be protected from any harm. But on that initial list were actually children, women, rabbis, friends of his, a girl dying of cancer. He gave the list to his Jewish two-fingered typist, Mimi Reinhardt, to type and maintain. He regularly added names to that list, and so the people on the list, instead of being sent to the gas chambers, were sent to his factory in Czechoslovakia, where their lives were spared. Oskar Schindler's list grew finally to over 1,100 persons whose lives were spared because of his conscience, his ethical core, his enormous courage, his willingness to sacrifice. If that subterfuge had become known, he would have been immediately executed, as would the typist of Schindler's List, Mimi Reinhardt. But they succeeded. At the end of Ms. Reinhardt's recent obituary, she had said of Oskar Schindler, whose failings she was quite aware of, he was a man who was risking his life all the time for what he was doing. Of course, Steven Spielberg made that story into a movie in 1993 that won 7 Academy Awards. Do you remember seeing it? It's still available on Amazon Prime. It's a hard film to watch, as it should be. I choose to open today with that story for 3 reasons. One is that today in America, younger persons are less and less informed about the horrors of the Holocaust. And that is a serious problem because in the phrase that should be our mantra, we're called to never forget. Second, in the U.S., the rate of anti-Semitic violence and bigotry is rapidly increasing. In Colorado, those incidents are 53% higher in 2021 than in 2020, according to the Defamation League. And in the U.S., the increase, in U.S. as a whole, the increase is 34%. Third, I see a connection between the risk, the sacrifice, the courage of the Samaritan in the Luke reading and the risk and courage of Mimi Reinhardt and Oskar Schindler. I'll talk about that shortly. The parable we heard might be familiar. It's one of 38 parables Jesus used as his primary teaching tools. One scholar called these the short stories of Jesus. Most of the stories have a surprise, even an offensive part, which would have been disturbing, perhaps insulting to the first century audience. I think there are 2 of those that are most familiar to us. This one and one other. They only show up in Luke's gospel, which makes Luke, for me, my favorite gospel. The other most familiar short story of Jesus is Luke 15. You know it. A father had 2 sons. One of the sons, the younger, decided to leave, came to his father and demanded his share of the inheritance. That's like saying to his father, I wish you were already dead. Now, when that was uttered, all the fathers in the first century audience were deeply offended, thinking the nerve of this kid, who does he think he is? And why would this father cave in to such an outrageous demand? The son leaves, goes into a different country, throws away all the money on wasteful living, winds up slopping hogs. He comes to his senses, says to himself, I can just go back to my father and work as a slave for him. That would be better than what I'm doing. He starts back. He practices his speech on the road. Father, I've sinned against God and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Father, I've sinned against God and against you. I'm no longer worthy. His father sees him on the road from far away. He's been looking for him, you see. And here is the scandal. He runs down the road, robes flapping, to embrace the son. Here is the second disturbing part of the story. No self-respecting Jewish middle-aged father would ever run, and certainly not to embrace such a scurrilous, disrespectful ass of a son, much less throw him a party. The story goes on to insult the faithful older brother. You can read that part. But the point is, Jesus has just told an immensely disrupting, disturbing story, and he was probably being booed by the crowd for that outrageous parable. Jesus was willing to be offensive to make a point about the grace of God. God is like this Father. In the Samaritan story we heard, what do you think the offense was? There are several. On that road from Jerusalem to Jericho, some of you have been there, we have, Judy and I have. It's a 3,000 feet drop from Jerusalem to Jericho. There are numerous switchbacks and blind corners, hiding places for thieves. It's a common place for violence and robbery. When the wounded and naked traveler is lying unconscious on the road, the first two travelers see him, ignore him, walk as far away as they can. There are two religious leaders who pass by on the other side, and that is not what their faith instructs them to do. It's like Jerry Falwell Jr. and Joel Osteen scurrying on by with their eyes down. They have excuses we might talk about at a different time. But next, the enemy, the most hostile pagan that the audience could imagine, comes by, goes to the naked, wounded man, tends to his wounds, takes him to a safe place, generously leaves money for him to cover expenses. A Samaritan does that. There was no such thing in that time as a good Samaritan. Jesus asks which one acted as a neighbor to the man. But they may not have been able to hear Jesus' question because they would have been so disturbed by this story about a holy disruptor who breaks their tribal values. See, not only is the Samaritan a disruptor in the story, Jesus is a holy disruptor for even daring to tell such a scandalous, offensive story. To understand Jesus, we have to remember he called himself a prophet, a truth teller, one who tells it like it is and is willing to make people uncomfortable with what they need to hear and not just what they want to hear. Jesus welcomed the outsiders, the misfits. Jesus even touched the lepers. Nobody touched the lepers in the first century. He was raised on the prophets, like Isaiah, who says, for God, chapter 58, I don't need your rituals. I'm asking for you to share your food with the needy, to care for the poor and vulnerable. Or Amos, who says in chapter 5, take away the noise of your worship. You have become too selfish and greedy. Instead, commit yourselves to justice, to the fair treatment for every person, especially the least, the last, and the left out. I wonder if that's the background for novelist Michael Connelly's character Harry Bosch, whose mantra is, do you remember? Everybody counts, or nobody counts. This concern for every human being, especially those outside the religious circles, is why I like Luke's gospel. Luke has a different version of the parable of the great feast. In Matthew, it's the respectable people who come to God's banquet, but in Luke, it's the misfits, the outsiders, those who are disabled, those who are crippled and blind, the nobodies, people whom the elite thought did not belong. They're the ones at the feast at God's table. This would be another one of Jesus' disturbing parables, of course. You may know we are still in a wrestling match in Methodism over who belongs in the family of God. For the last 50 years, we have disagreed over whether persons who identify as LGBTQ are as worthy as others. could be that none of us is worthy on our own, that only God's grace is what allows us to belong. And there may be some bishops in our country who need to remember that all are welcome because of God's invitation. The mantra from Anne Lamott, out of her own personal journey through alcohol dependency and drug dependency, it's on one of the walls close to our kitchen. God accepts us right where we are. Do you remember the rest of that quote? And loves us too much to leave us where we are. Back to our divided condition as Methodists, we have a group of church members across the world and some congregations who are splintering away from the large mainstream Methodist Church over their belief that gay and lesbian persons, members and clergy, are not as valuable to God, not as worthy in God's eyes as others. That is not the ethic of Jesus Christ, the attitude of Christ, but it's happening. And it has happened for way too long. Universal Church, in my mind, has a lot of repenting and changing to do over that issue. That bigotry has been seen in many places, one described by one of my favorite musical artists, Brandi Carlile, in her experience as a teenager growing up in her fundamentalist church in Seattle. Brandi Carlile has won 5 Grammy Awards for her Americana music. In her book, titled Broken Horses, she tells of her experience at age 16 as she was preparing to be baptized in her home congregation, not a Methodist church. She had been attending baptism preparation classes led by her pastor for a while. The date for her baptism had been set. She invited all of her friends, all of her large family to this event. The day arrived. She was meeting individually with her pastor for 5 minutes just before the sacred ceremony. He had only 2 questions for her. In those final few minutes, he first asked, "Do you practice witchcraft?" She said, "No." And then he asked, "Do you practice homosexuality?" Brandi Carlile had been out by that time and fairly open about her sexual identity, but she was deeply shocked and humiliated and embarrassed, felt she had just been sucker punched at the last second. She ran out of the room, ran out of the interview, ran out of the church building, had to leave her family, her closest friends there in the audience, and she had been wounded by a person who thought he was representing the welcoming heart of Jesus Christ. And he was doing the opposite. She stayed away from any church for many, many years, but this story has a happier ending. She rediscovered a form of Christianity that is authentically Christian and Christ-like, and began to read mainstream, open-minded thinkers like Father Richard Rohr, finally reconnected with a welcoming and progressive church represented by the open and affirming spirit of St. Andrew Church. Let me rehearse. There is nothing in the Bible that prohibits gay marriage. Did you know that? And most of you know by now what Jesus said about homosexuality, right? What did he say? He said nothing. If you want to know more about that discussion, I commend the website for the group of retired Methodist clergy I've been working with for the past 5 years. The United Methodist Association of Retired Clergy and Friends. The website is umarc.org. We have now over 1,000 members across the world, 1,500 on our mailing list. We have a webinar coming up next Tuesday night that covers more about our splintering as Methodists. It's one of several splintering movements in American Methodism over the past 200 years. I commend to you that free 90-minute webinar next Tuesday night at 6 p.m. You can register on our website, umarc.org. Tuesday night, the Reverend Adam Hamilton, well-known pastor in Kansas City, author of over 1,500 books. He's been a guest speaker here at St. Andrew right after I retired. Over 15 books, including one on the Bible. He's our featured speaker. I've also brought copies today of a monograph on the Bible and homosexuality. If you're not able to find that here in person, write the church office and we'll send it to you. I mentioned other occasions when American Methodists have divided and splintered off. The largest, most painful one was in 1844 over slavery and racism. The issue of racism, white supremacy, white fragility is still one of the most divisive in our country and our culture. Reverend Mark rightly called it a few months ago our original sin in America. I am staggered to read recently that a majority of Caucasian Americans believe that white people experience as much discrimination today as people of color. That is just an ignorance of American history. And it's another sign of our need for repentance, for turning in a new direction. Let's rehearse a bit of history. In the last 400 years, here are the highlights I see, the lowlights actually. Early in America, black persons were seen as so inferior they were only considered to be 3/5 of a person. Our most costly, most bloody American war was the Civil War, in which 600,000 Americans were killed by their fellow Americans over whether one American could be owned by a fellow American. There are still some folks who cherish the Confederacy 160 years later. Reconstruction in the years after that war was a failure because so many whites were threatened by the emerging equality of people of color. Horribly violent uprising from whites, such as the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, were not taught much in history books until recently. Did you learn about the Tulsa Massacre in your history classes? Why was that, do you suppose? After World War II, white veterans from that war were granted benefits in the GI Bill that gave them financial help to pursue higher education. Black veterans were not included in that benefit. Why was that? In the latter half of the 20th century, black citizens were victims of the secret real estate practice of redlining, keeping people of color from moving into the most desirable neighborhoods. We saw violence and rioting in the 1950s and 1960s in our schools when we tried to integrate schools where black children like Ruby Bridges, you see her in the Norman Rockwell painting here, has to be escorted by federal marshals into her new school where she was verbally attacked and spat upon. And we see parents today in some school districts who do not want children to see that picture from Norman Rockwell because, I don't know, are they embarrassed by what occurred from white parents? We see parents protesting what they call critical race theory, which there are vague definitions of. And from what I've read, what some people refer to as CRT is just the honest, accurate teaching of all of American history. I like what PBS guru Ken Burns says. Being an American means reckoning with a history fraught with violence and injustice. And ignoring that is in favor of mythology is not only wrong, but dangerous. The dark chapters of American history have just as much to teach us, if not more, than the glorious ones, and often the two are intertwined. There's more troubling news. Some school districts have had meetings where parents accuse teachers of indoctrinating students with negative history. Responding to that, one teacher said on social media, "Please just know that if in fact we were brainwashing or indoctrinating students, we would start with having them do all their homework on time, pay attention in class, study hard, and bring us coffee every day." Let me close with a quote from another of my favorite musicians. Jackson Browne has been making memorable music for the last 40 or 50 years. You will know him from some of his best hits, Running on Empty, The Pretender, Doctor My Eyes. He's about my age. He's in his 70s now, but he has not finished teaching us and maybe even troubling us. His last album, Downhill from Everywhere, 10 months ago released, contains some important pieces. He writes about our crisis with the oceans of the world. He sings about the immigration crisis. My favorite is called When Justice is Real. In that song, he does what Jesus does. He asks some important questions. Jesus was an asker of questions. Do you remember any of those? The questions Jesus asks are like, why do you worry so much? Will that really help you? We heard that from a sermon a couple of weeks ago. Or what does it profit a person if they gain the whole world and lose their soul? Today he might be more specific. What does it profit a politician if they gain all the power and money and lose their soul? Or the question, what do you want me to do for you? One of my favorites. Here are a couple of questions Jackson Browne asks in that song about justice. What is democracy? What is the deal? What does it look like? How does it feel? And this spiritual question, what is the good life? What is wealth? And he says, here's a good question to be asking right now in our country, in the world. What will you put up with? What will you allow? The title of that song again is When Justice is Real. It's not real yet, he says, though we give lip service to it in the pledge to our flag. Justice is a central biblical image. What does the Lord require of us? Micah asks. Justice, kindness, humility. And Jesus, in his harshest words for the self-righteous religious hypocrites in Matthew 23, he was deeply troubled by hypocrisy, for their majoring in minors, says what you should have been doing is justice and peace. The story of the Samaritan hero is subversive and offensive. It stirred up his audience because they believed God liked them best, and he showed them their God was too small. Last week, Reverend Mark left us with some questions, and two blazing images in those questions for me have stuck with me. He asks us, are you called by God to be a truth teller? And is God calling you to be a holy disruptor like Jesus? To be a risk taker like the Samaritan who, as he was kneeling beside the traveler to help him, might have been mistaken by a passerby for the one who attacked him and then be attacked himself. What risk are you willing to take as a truth teller? Where are you willing to embrace the ethic of Christ and be a holy disruptor? Will you pray and think with me about that?
The whole world with the crumbs of old bread. Spread the good news through dreams and stones. With the breath of your wind, you could raise up the dead, but you ask us to go and help us love mercy. Help us do justly. Help us walk humbly with you. Slave. Oh God, please remember, helpless today. Call on your children, repairing the breach. There's no place too far that your mercy can reach. Help us love mercy. Help us do justly. And help us walk humbly with you.
Every worship service at St. Andrew is made possible only through the many hours of work that our audiovisual staff and volunteers put in each and every week. This week, we want to highlight the faithful service of Rob Polite and Harry Chandler, who serve you, me, and all of us behind the scenes, compiling and creating everything you see on the screen during worship with patience, creativity, enthusiasm, and great attention to detail. Normally, the only time we think about AV is when something goes wrong, when a microphone feeds back or a word is misspelled on a slide. Let's not forget how much work and intention goes into creating excellent and distraction-free production support so that we can focus on connecting with God and with one another in worship. Please take a moment to thank Harry and Rob next time you see them. Maybe head back to the AV booth and give them a little wave of appreciation. As we've massively upgraded our AV systems over the past 2 years, we've been able to dramatically increase our reach and expand our online presence. Our weekly live streams and our online campus worship services are reaching an average of 1,600 to 2,200 people per week. That means that a majority of the St. Andrew congregation is still choosing to worship and engage with this community online, and we continue to reach new people, expanding our congregation every single week. We are so privileged to be able to serve folks who are unable to join us in person, and thanks to the work of the Satellite Community Strategy Team, we are looking forward to expanding and evolving the way we do online church to reach many more people who may never set foot on this campus. Thank you again for the way you've supported our growth and expansion over the past few years, bearing with us through many growing pains as we've developed and implemented our new systems and strategies. May we continue to reach outward, utilizing technology to share the message and ministry of this church, eradicating social isolation in our community and beyond. And now, as you return to the rhythms and routines of your busy lives this week, I leave you with this benediction. God, who created you in the divine image, sends you forth. We go to reflect the presence of our Creator to everyone we meet. Jesus, who has redeemed you, has established the reign of God in our midst. We go to bring healing to the broken of the world. The Holy Spirit, who calls you to be God's people, goes with you to many places. We go to tear down the walls that divide us and to build lives of hope for all of God's children. And now may the peace of the rolling waves, the peace of the silent mountains, the peace of the singing stars, and the deep, deep peace of the Prince of Peace be with you now and forever. Amen.